But I think that it's super important for the public to realize that it's okay to not be okay, and most people aren't okay, even if they seem like they are. So addiction aside, I would say that if that person looks perfectly fine and they look like they're perfectly okay, you just probably don't know what's behind closed doors. Most people are not okay, and it's okay to not be okay most days. Everybody's just on a journey and everybody's learning. So I would say it's super important to advocate for prevention, for mental health, and for substance use prevention, and make those connections and break that stigma about all of that out in the community, because there are a lot of assumptions, and especially in rural Kentucky and rural America, people think not just that addiction is stigmatized. A lot of people have a really big stigma when it comes to mental health and mental health treatment. And in America, we've always had that for the longest time. Mental health has really been ignored, and now they're saying, I think that was a huge mistake, and that's where we need to go. And lots of times addiction and mental health, they coincide, co-occurring disorders. Sometimes it's the chicken or the egg first. Lots of times it's addiction, and that can create imbalances in your brain, and then lots of times it's a mental health issue, and then that can create you relying on substances to self-medicate. So really, it's all a big cycle, and it's really important to address both.
Hello, dear listener. At whatever hour it is that you're listening to this show, we're glad you're doing it now. Thank you guys for tuning in today. You're listening to The Local Lens, the podcast from the Powell County Health Department and Kentucky Rio, where we go inside our community's experience with the drug epidemic. Our show is coming to you from Stanton, Kentucky, nestled at the foothills of Appalachia. And this week we are joined by Jerrica Brandenburg from Estill County, our next door neighbor. And she is a counselor, a drug and alcohol therapist, and she really just has her feet in a lot of different projects and a lot of different programs. So she's been around this whole area for several years of her life now, and though she's young, she has seen a lot and she's been really involved. Anyways, enough with the opening chitter chatter. Let's go on and get into the show. I'm your host, Nate Brooks. You're listening to The Local Lens. These are our people using our voices, telling our stories, because no one sees it like we do.
My name is Jerrica Brandenburg, and I am originally from Irvine, Kentucky, born and raised here. I moved away a few times, but it just brings you back. So,
What'd you move away to?
So I've moved to North Carolina once.
What part?
Closer to the beach, to the coast.
That is all right.
Yeah, it was nice.
Yeah, nice. And then what brought you back here from there?
So I just moved there for a year after college, just kind of didn't know where I was going, and came back.
Nice. What did you do for college?
So in undergrad, I majored in public health, and then in graduate school, it's clinical mental health.
We were going over this a bit briefly. You work in a lot of different areas all around harm reduction, around just counseling in general. Tell us in one sentence what you do, though.
So in one sentence, what I do is I'm a certified alcohol and drug counselor, and that is my primary focus. So at almost any job I have, my counseling comes into play there.
Okay.
But pretty much, so I have my feet in a lot of things. I have, and still am, a mentor for Camp Mariposa.
Okay. Through
the Moyer Foundation. I have been a counselor and also that mental health provider in several locations here in town.
Okay.
And then I've served on several boards.
So Camp Mariposa is this really, really, really cool thing, and that was actually the reason why we wanted to interview Jerrica initially. So we're going to spend some time on that now.
Camp Mariposa is actually Spanish. Mariposa means butterfly.
Okay.
And so Camp Mariposa is for kids ages 9 to 12 typically, and they just need to have a first or second degree relative who has had addiction problems or has struggled with addiction in the past, even if they're in recovery now. Basically just that their lives have been touched by addiction in some way. And it's a really cool experience. It's typically overnight for one weekend every other month.
Okay.
So we'll do Friday night and Saturday night one weekend, and then on the months that we don't have camp, which would also be every other month, we have a family fun day. And that's where they can bring everybody and their whole family. And you might go bowling, you might go to the movies. It's just a daytime trip. You might go to the pool. And you hope that if someone's still in addiction, maybe they'll get brought to that, or even if they're early in recovery, but it lets them know it's all free to them, and it gives them a really good sense of family, togetherness. It's a very wholesome day. Their siblings can come no matter how young or old they are. So if they're younger, they get to see what kind of fun it would be if they participated. And if they're older, they still seem to enjoy it a lot too. Grandparents can come, anybody. But it's all about transforming their life, kind of like the butterfly. And that was formed by Jamie Moyer, who's a pro baseball player, and his wife, because they had a niece on one side of their family who they actually ended up raising, I believe, or raising for some time due to addiction from one of their siblings. And so they saw fit. And a lot of years they actually will give enough Reds tickets for us to not only take all the camp kids, but some other school children as well.
Oh, cool. Nice.
Just to see. And a lot of those kids have never seen a pro baseball game, so they absolutely love it. And it's just been a really transformative experience for all the adults that attend. If anybody ever wants to volunteer, we always encourage that, even if it's just a lesson they want to do, not be a mentor. It's just a really great experience. And we give them coins that have the Serenity Prayer on it and then a butterfly on the other side.
That's super cool.
That's kind of cool. It's almost like the sobriety chips that you get at AA or NA for the time you've been sober, but they get one of those after they've been in camp for so long and they've shared their story. The coolest activity we do there is we have a campfire, and they write letters to addiction, and in that they can say anything they want, but most of the kids have some pretty tough things they'd like to say. There are lots of tears. If they'd like a mentor to read it, they can instead, and then we burn the letters. Okay. And that's just a really releasing experience for most of the children, and really helps them. And I mean, it's very emotional for all the adults too.
Oh, I imagine. And then how old are most of the kids that are there?
9 to 12.
Okay.
If you're above the age of 12, you can still say, but you have to become a junior mentor, which means we just train you on how to help us help them.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And if you want to find out more about Camp Mariposa, call them at 865-214-2544. That's 865-214-2544. And how long have you been involved with that?
I would say I've been involved with Camp Mariposa for at least 3 to 4 years. Okay. And then I've been involved in the addiction and prevention field for about 7 years now.
For about 7 years, okay. So was that something that when you were in school, did you know that you wanted to come back and, well, maybe not come back, but get involved in
Absolutely not.
Okay.
So, growing up, I actually had a parent who was in addiction. Okay. And so I tried really hard, I think, to steer away from anyone or anything that had anything to do with that, because I think I labeled it as bad in my mind. And that was everyone I knew who had been involved in that, they died or went away for a long time. If not death, maybe to prison even. Okay. And so I went to undergrad. And it just so happened that Renee Alexander, who's now Renee Salyers, was the director of West Care here in Irvine. And I decided to do my internship there with public health. And I did it there for 6 months, and I saw that it was kind of stressful. They did a diversion program with a lot of people coming out of jail, and it was to rehabilitate them, because that was an outpatient rehab pretty much, and a sober living spot. And I really loved it, and they said that I did really well communicating, and there weren't many barriers, and I didn't really make the clients feel uncomfortable. I could mesh with them really easily, and that was great, but I really wasn't interested in staying there. So I did like it, but I moved away for about a year to North Carolina, and I came back, and actually, my mom had me apply for the job there, because she just really said that people kept mentioning it to her. We knew Renee through some other avenues, and she had left, and they were looking for somebody. So I applied, and I didn't even want the job at the time, and I got it, and I was really shocked, and I was like, well, I guess I'm moving back permanently. Yeah. And that was what I would consider to be my first big girl job. So there I was like 22 or 23, and I was the director of an outpatient rehab, which blew my mind, which is why I didn't think I would get it. And that was a cool experience. I really, really mourned probably. I chose to leave the job, but I really mourned it because it really transformed me as a person. And I think that through that internship I had done, I saw that no matter what, I'd always been told, well, if that person chooses to do drugs, they are choosing to do that instead of be with their children or give to their children, or they're choosing that over their family. And at that point, I really started looking at it as more of a disease. And after I mean, I had a lot of pregnant girls in the group when I was an intern there. And so I had lots of conversations with them. And I just started to discover that at some point in your addiction, it's no longer a choice when you wake up every morning. It's like you wake up and you feel like you need it as much as you need air. And at that point, they don't feel like they can bring themselves back out of it. And so I think that I really, that's when I saw it as a disease, not as much as a choice anymore at some point.
Somebody actually told me that. I forget who it was, but he said that he resented when people said that he had a disease because he said it made him feel powerless against it. When he knew that, like, if he wanted to start getting better, then he would eventually recover. But at the same time, there is, like, it is a chemical thing going on in your head. So, like, what do you think you call it then?
I am very much about it being a disease.
Yeah.
Because I think that that's, when you come from a treatment perspective, a lot of people haven't been about, like, medication-assisted therapies and things like that. And when you look at it from a disease perspective, it's like, would you rather them be on MAT and at least be able to function and have a better chance of getting out of it, or would you rather find them overdosed and dead, or in cardiac arrest, things like that? So I think that if you can ask a mom of someone who's overdosed and ask them their thoughts on MAT, and most of the time they probably would have rather their kid be on MAT than find them dead from addiction. Or even mental health. Would you rather find someone who's committed suicide, or would you rather them get treatment through antidepressants or anything like that if they need it? So I think if you start looking at all that from a more disease model, because people have stigmas against the types of treatment that we're going towards, it just, it can spiral out. There's so many stigmas. We could talk all day about it.
So it's interesting hearing how her own knowledge about addiction being a disease was growing, because that's pretty similar to how my learning process for it also went. And I feel like that's pretty similar to how everyone's learning process with it goes. But it just goes to show that addiction and recovery is one of those fields where once you learn about it, then you're going to be on the side of recovery. You're going to be in support of this, but it starts with learning about it, and you have to willingly and purposefully go learn about it.
Yeah, and I am a firm believer, and they say this in addiction treatment as well, that once you're doing the right thing, the right things will come along. Usually to newly sober people, but I'm a firm believer. I wasn't looking to be planted there. I was really resistant, actually, but I'm a firm believer that if you're doing what you're supposed to be and you're trying your hardest, that you'll get planted where you're supposed to be, that the universe will help you find that.
And if you think that sounds like a hippie thing to say, then buddy, stick around for a bit more. We get into it later. But even though we're both happy to be working in this field, that doesn't mean that it is a happy field to be working in at all.
It comes with a lot of stress and a lot of sorrow, because when you have a client that ends up passing away, even if it's after, that is always just so hard. And when I was in North Carolina specifically, I remember I got a Facebook request from someone who'd been my client, and it had been a male, and you're not allowed to accept requests. As a counselor, you're really not supposed to ever, but as an intern still at that point for a year. And I remember the girl that was the director with me, she had already moved as well. And so I told her that I got a request, and I felt bad for not being able to accept it, and she said she had got one too, and she didn't accept it either. And about a week later, they found him dead. And they said, there were drugs involved and things, and it was an overdose. And I will never forget that, because I was very close to him in his process. I'd never seen a lot of men cry growing up. And I remember seeing that man cry because he did not want to face that he had done drugs and was going to test positive, and it might cost him seeing his children. And that was a really changing experience as well.
Yeah. And so it makes sense why they want to have that border in there between like the counselors and the clients. But that has to be a hard border to set up for yourself, though, especially with people that you care about, right?
Right. I mean, I feel like in every way of life that we have to set boundaries for ourselves just to be healthy. And honestly, most people in addiction have a really hard time setting boundaries in just every little thing you can imagine. And it's hard for everyday people. And so with counselors, they are super strict. I mean, like all the boards that govern us are so strict, and it really is just to protect, because they want to make sure that when you're a counselor, you could be in a position of power in some way, knowing these things about someone. You can't just say, well, if you do this and this, like if somebody owns, let's just for instance say they own a business, you don't want them to give you cheaper services or better services just because you know things about them. So they just want to have a thick boundary because of this power differentials, I guess.
So listening to that story, then it's easy to see why there might not be that many counselors around, but we really need for there to be more counselors. And you can hear in our episode from several months ago with Scott Seitz, a nurse practitioner who was working in Stanton at the time, that we have a shortage of counselors. And it's pretty likely that a part of the solution is to have more counselors around. Are you a part of the solution to that, would you say?
Yeah. So I actually this semester finished up my last clinical rotations and everything like that for the clinical mental health program.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And that is a big weight off my shoulders. And I definitely think that mental health and substance use go hand in hand. And honestly, in most small towns, if you get a degree, and just in my opinion, it seems like if you get a degree in mental health or counseling, it seems like they don't stick around. At least in Powell County and Estill County, it seems like there's not a plethora of those individuals as professionals. And so I never really wanted to come back to Estill County. I really wanted to escape, I think. And once I went away, I realized how special it was to be able to walk down the street and know everyone. And so where I feel like I fit into that is really, I love psychoeducation, not just therapy, and doing psychoeducation with the community.
Okay.
I'm also a certified Narcan trainer.
Okay.
And so is Misty Dehart, who I think is also on one of your podcasts. And we do a lot of local trainings through a coalition that's local in Kentucky for Narcan. So I really feel like that is where I fit into the piece, and then also doing therapy with people. But I feel like you really have to touch someone kind of to get them in lots of times. To get them in the therapy room. So, most of the time people don't see advertisements for therapy and be like, oh, sign me up.
Yeah.
But they could have an experience with you out doing psychoeducation or prevention, and that might bring them in. And that's unique because a lot of therapists don't get to get out there and meet people like that. And I do in lots of the roles that I'm in.
Yeah.
And if they see that I can communicate with them from a non-judgmental perspective out in the community, they're going to be like, what's that girl's name and number? Because maybe I should go see her, or maybe I should go to therapy. Maybe it's not that bad. But I think that it's super important for the public to realize that most of the time, it's okay to not be okay, and most people aren't okay, even if they seem like they are. So addiction aside, I would say that if that person looks perfectly fine and they look like they're perfectly okay, you just probably don't know what's behind closed doors. Most people are not okay, and it's okay to not be okay most days. Everybody's just on a journey, and everybody's learning. So I would say it's super important to advocate for prevention, for mental health, and for substance use prevention, and make those connections and break that stigma about all of that out in the community, because there are a lot of assumptions, and especially in rural Kentucky and rural America, people think not just that addiction is stigmatized. A lot of people have a really big stigma when it comes to mental health and mental health treatment. And in America, we've always had that for the longest time. Mental health has really been ignored, and now they're saying, I think that was a huge mistake, and that's where we need to go. And lots of times addiction and mental health, they coincide, co-occurring disorders. Sometimes it's the chicken or the egg first. Lots of times it's addiction, and that can create imbalances in your brain, and then lots of times it's a mental health issue, and then that can create you relying on substances to self-medicate. So really, it's all a big cycle, and it's really important to address both.
Okay, so the reason people exercise is to stay healthy, to keep their body in good shape. We need to be doing the same thing for our mental health. So let's look at some ways that we can help our mental health like that.
So other than going to therapy, a lot of good things to do are just like therapeutic techniques. There are lots of Instagrams that you can follow. There are lots of websites that you can look up. One of those things that we do at Camp Mariposa is every night I usually do meditation with the girls, all in their cabin. And sometimes I even go down to the boys' cabin and sit in like their living room with all their bedroom doors open with their male mentors in there, and I will like basically talk really loudly. It's not very meditating for me, but they ask me when it's bedtime. All of the campers want me to do it after the first few times we've done it. People think it's really hard usually to meditate or self-soothe, but actually you're just learning to clear your mind and think about sometimes like what your body is doing at the time, and every time you find your mind going away from that, bringing it back to your breathing, what your body's feeling, and that can help you relax, go to sleep. I feel like doing alternative practices like that at home that are healthy and proven can also be a good alternative if you're not ready for therapy. Stress reduction, nature. Even in some therapies like EMDR, you might take a client hiking because it's easier for them to divert their eye contact to things while you were hiking with them, for instance. That would be like a really alternative therapy or therapy situation where you get to go hiking with them. But that can be really helpful, especially with trauma, because people are so uncomfortable. And so there is a really good TED Talk about addiction, and I cannot remember the name of it, but if you look up Rat Park and then addiction TED Talk, it should pop up. And it talks about how really they found that the opposite of addiction is actually connection. And I really believe that the main, we might hear somebody revving, they might agree with me, but I really hear that the primary thing behind addiction, I think, is disconnection. And so the best thing, and if you watch that or listen to it, you'll find that even it says the best thing you could do for somebody in addiction that you know is not enable them or anything like that, but say, if you need me to sit with you in order to be sober or to keep your mind off of it, I am willing to do that with you as long as you're sober. And just being there for people, because they proved in this Rat Park study back in the day that they could put like cocaine and water, and that the rats would just like continuously use the cocaine until they died. And when they, put all kinds of little toys in there, there were males and females all in a big cage, and they had lots of things to do, and their life was really fulfilling, they would use it, but very rarely would they get addicted, and I don't think any died. And I think that's a really good study to look at. And they just talk about different countries and what they've done to solve the problem. And it's just the best example I can give that anybody should watch and really take to heart.
Now, granted, we are humans and not rats, and we're not saying that humans work the same way that rats do. But you can start seeing the common thread, and it actually makes sense that it is more effective and healthier to be seeking happiness rather than avoiding sadness. So this next little bit about the peyote plant and that whole experience, stick with us through it. It comes back around, I promise.
So peyote is like this cactus type plant out in the desert, and it is a hallucinogen. So I'm like, follow me here for just a minute. This is a wild train to go on.
All right.
And back in, the day, Native Americans would do that, but it was more of like a coming of age thing from what I understand. And it was more like you do this, and then you have a guide, and then you come back and you try to find that feeling and what you found out there in everyday life, not using it habitually.
Okay.
It's like you find, this great inner peace, or maybe you see or feel, have a good experience, and then you try to do that in everyday life, but then you know what you're looking for in case you've never found it before. And I feel like I was lucky enough that in my, journey in probably the past 10 years, I feel like I have been able to find what I'm looking for, and I know that feeling already. So it's just, for me now, it's figuring out how to get that every day. And I've learned that it's like through hiking and things like that for me, and following my passions that bring me that very electric feeling, and finding your purpose.
Insert here John Denver's Rocky Mountain High song, that classic song. All that we're talking about here is finding a healthy way to get that dopamine boost, which is how people experience happiness.
And I think that a lot of people in modern society, especially when it starts out recreationally, they do it and then they do it and do it, and they don't really have this purpose behind it. They don't go into it thinking like that. So then their brain chemicals sometimes get messed up, and then they fall into addiction. And if you're trying to self-medicate, you might not also have that guided thing that I just told you about. Your chemicals get even more out of balance, and that's a very alternative way to look at the whole problem.
It absolutely is a very alternative way to look at it. But what it's doing is you're backing up and you're looking at the reasons why people use drugs in the first place. So we continue that conversation here.
Today's society is very disconnected, and we don't really have this purpose or this direction, and young people are really suffering, and then that's just going generation through generation.
How do you think, is that ship too big to turn back to get right on the right path again?
I don't. I am very alternative, I feel like, in my thoughts. And I've read so many studies about how one primate, they can show them how to do something on the other side of the world, and primates on the other side of the world will somehow start doing the same thing. It's almost like this giant collective. And I think we're in this time of really formative change in our country and our world, and I think that just if enough people start realizing that and seeing that it catches on.
Okay.
And we've seen a lot of movements during COVID, everybody's having to isolate and stuff, but I think that it's not too big to turn around. I think it's a shift in thinking and a shift in like the stigma and everything. So once enough people get on board, kind of like with COVID vaccinations, what is it, like herd immunity after 70 or 75%? If you can change 50% up of everybody's, perceptions of how those things work, and their judgments, you could probably change the world.
Yeah.
It may not even take 50%. I'm sure we were at an extremely low percent.
And that brings us right up to the end of the episode. Do you have any other big thoughts or anything?
I think some of my biggest thoughts that I've ever had in my life, I just laid out on the table about like my feeling of work. Let's hope that none of them get me in trouble. Anything.
No, I don't think so. And if they do, I'll vouch for you.
Some of them can be quite alternative, but they are just how I found my way and how I think other people could. Not just, in what we've talked about, but just in finding where you fit in to the solution to different problems in the world. It's to think alternatively. It's not always, sometimes the best answers are hidden in plain sight, but you don't think to look for them.
And that is all the time that we have for this episode today. Thank you first and foremost to Jerrica Brandenburg. You're incredible. I love the way you think about this stuff. It's super interesting to me. But yeah, thank you for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with us. Also, thank you to WSKV for broadcasting the show on the radio, and also a huge thanks to the Powell County Health Department and Kentucky Rio and all the lovely folks at both of those organizations for letting this show be a thing. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. If you're online, then get on Facebook and follow us and tell the world about how much you listen to this show and what you think about it. We want to hear your thoughts on this stuff. So we covered a lot of ground on this episode, so I've put a few different links to our past episodes down in the description below. Anyways, that's all the time that we have. I'm your host, Nate Brooks. Thank you guys for listening to our show this week. You've been listening to The Local Lens. These are our people, using our voices, telling our stories. because no one sees it like we do.